And here we are again. And after having inspected the deepness of hardware-based firmware protection mechanism, it's time to move to another deeply technical tool. The next speaker works as security researcher for CyberArk company. Actually, I think he is probably one of the worst nightmares for a huge number of vendors. The number of vulnerabilities that he discovered, in fact, is really impressive. His name is Eran Shimony, and now he will show us how it's possible to find 16 CVE in 60 days. Go, Eran.
Hello everyone, and thanks for attending to this online session about how I found 60 CVEs in 60 days. Since we are after lunch, let's start with a quick mind teaser: how to find local elevation of privilege vulnerabilities on Windows. Well, I'm not here to talk about fuzzing or rather symbolic execution or any other approach that works with fuzzing. Here we will see a different approach to find security bugs that I developed, which I call MTE. MTE stands for Monitor, Trace, and Exploit. In the essence of it, you monitor every privileged process that runs on the system, followed by tracing its file operations. If those privileged file operations are not done with care, we might exploit them with two simple file manipulation attacks. You are probably familiar with them because they're not that new. DLL hijacking goes back to the year of 2000, and James Forshaw first presented the abuse of object manager symbolic links in the year of 2015. Still, by using those two file manipulation attacks automatically, I found many bugs across many vendors. Now, a bit before we dive in, I'll present myself. I'm Eran Shimony, a security researcher at CyberArk. I mostly work on Windows, primarily at discovering logical bugs, specifically speaking privilege escalation. While I do look at other platforms, Windows is my main focus. Besides that, I'm notoriously known to blue screen my own Windows machine, and I really enjoy making and mixing cocktails, and of course drinking them as well. And I hope you see the connection between blue screens and cocktails. So what are we going to talk about? We will see how one might easily make usage of symbolic links for elevation of privilege attacks, followed by looking how you can do something I call lazy privilege escalation, waiting for a privileged code to load resources from unprotected directories and taking advantage of it. After that, we will visit MTE and see that we can reliably check if a privileged process are vulnerable to file manipulation attacks. I believe you will see that finding EOP bugs in mass is not that difficult, and you can probably achieve the same results yourself. You only need a way to properly define when a program is vulnerable to file manipulation attacks and how you can actually automate the entire exploitation process. This slide is a slide that you almost find in any privilege escalation talk. Microsoft usually divides security boundaries as separation between the user's privilege levels. In Windows, privilege violation is a sort of perspective of how an attack might be, where an attacker wants to move between privilege levels. Anything that consists moving up the privilege level could be arguably considered a bypass of a security boundary. In other words, every vertical jump in the hierarchy would cause most vendors to fix it and would end up with a CVE. This is true aside from a transition between an administrator to the kernel. In this case, it falls to the UAC bypass category, which is not considered a vulnerability by Microsoft eyes, which I do not entirely agree with. All the vulnerabilities that I found originated in services or installers. The reasons behind focusing on those pieces of software is that they are almost always privileged. Hence, every bug in there is a bug in a privileged code that will probably lead you to some kind of elevation of privilege. Besides that, most bugs in those components are relatively easy to find and not that too hard to implement. We can probably automate the entire process. Now, if the word symbolic link sounds familiar, it's because this concept exists on Unix platform for many years. On Unix, symbolic links are files that contain the path of the file they point on. So when the kernel tries to access the symbolic link, it will parse the value in the symlink file, followed by following the symbolic link's path. In Windows, symbolic links are a different thing. At the beginning of the NT days, we only had object manager symbolic links and registry symbolic links. An object manager symbolic link is an object that used to translate a reference to one named object into another name. When created, it links the name of the symbolic links to the name of the target object. This target object could be of any type that Object Manager supports, including another symbolic link. This type of link was supposed to be used by driver developers and by the system only. The second, or rather the third type of symbolic link is the NTFS mount point, or directory junctions. The NTFS mount points were first introduced in Windows 2000 and they allow system to have a directory-like symbolic link. Both the creations of Object Manager symbolic links and NTFS mount points do not require special privileges and can be done by the regular user, which is not true for the NTFS symbolic links presented in Windows Vista. Those are real file system symbolic links that are like the ones in Unix platform. Still, they require the user to be an administrator, so they are not useful in the case of elevation of privilege attacks. To use Object Manager symbolic links, we must first learn about the Object Manager. Here we have a snippet of the sysinternal tool called WinOBJ, which showcases us the Object Manager file system. Now, the Object Manager has a different subsystem than the regular file system, and it resides in the Windows Executive. Its main job is to maintain a wide catalog of all objects in the system. Another job of the Object Manager is to parse names passed by it by the I/O Manager, whenever a create file request is being received. Now, the Object Manager namespace is organized in a hierarchy tree. Each level is an object of the type of object directory. Each object directory has a name and can have multiple nested object directories within, and it starts with the \root directory. One of the most famous directories in Windows is the C directory. The C directory is not a real directory on disk. Instead, the C directory is an object in the Object Manager of the type of a symbolic link. This object holds the value of the real path of the device, the hard drive. In our case, C is reparsed to \device\hard disk volume 4. Every time you do file operations on files inside the C volume, you get the value of the symbolic link. Every object directory is a secureable resource. Not everyone can access any object in the Object Manager namespace, and you need the relevant permissions with you if you want to edit it. But what if we can create new symbolic links that will point to files of our desire? What can we do with it? It turns out there is such a place, the object directory \rpc control, which can be mounted from a regular user. We will see shortly how to do so. By calling create file with the create new flag, we can reparse the create operations to achieve arbitrary file creation in arbitrary locations. We can also change the file output file name because we can set any name we wish in the Object Manager symbolic link. This, however, will only allow us to create empty files because the default permissions of a file created by a service do not allow editing. The second type of bugs is a process that does a write file operation on a file in an unprotected directory using its privilege access token. We can do the same as before, and now the reparsed file will contain the content of the write operation, but we won't have the option to edit it. Luckily, sometimes the privilege code will call setSecurityFile API on the file, changing its permission and allowing regular users to edit it. This is also called an arbitrary write vulnerability. From there, we can either replace the file contents with a DLL and just escalate to system via DLL hijacking. Luckily, sometimes the privilege code will call the setSecurityFile API on the file, changing its permissions and allowing regular users the option to edit it. This is also called an arbitrary write vulnerability. From there, we can replace the file's contents with a DLL and just escalate to system via DLL hijacking. The call of setSecurityFile also rarely happens in our first case of the create file, but it's more common here. Lastly, if we find a service that calls the delete file on a file in an unprotected path, we can reparse the delete operation and delete an arbitrary protected file. Deleting every desired file in the context of a trusted privilege process is useful for malware and alike. To escalate into system, you usually need another primitive unless you just want to do some denial of service to the local machine. Let's see how this can be done. The first thing is we want to create a mount point. We take advantage of the fact that the Object Manager has a bunch of object directories. Since there is at least one object directory, we have some permissions over it to create new objects there. We can create a mount point there. This directory is the object directory \rpc control. We basically mount a local directory that will be linked to the object manager namespace by calling create directory API, followed by calling device IO control with a set reparse point flag will do the trick. It cannot be that easy, right? Well, we do have some limitations. The directory must be empty before we change it into a mount point. Therefore, we need to have the permission to delete every file there. Also, we need to have write permissions over the directory. Interestingly, we do not need to have full permissions over the directory, like we do not need to have the permission to actually delete the directory. The second thing we need for a successful attack is to create an object manager symbolic link. The great thing about it is that anyone can create them. Unfortunately, you are somewhat limited in the namespace selection, and you cannot create permanent links. This because it requires admin privileges to do so. Sadly, if the symbolic links are not permanent, the symlink will get deleted if every handle to this object is closed. Therefore, upon a restart, the symbolic link object will be gone. So persisting the system in this way is not going to work unless you are an administrator. But non-permanent links are still very useful for elevation of privilege attacks. Okay, so let's see what happens under the hood. If we look at how path translation works, we have a service that does the create file operations on cdir file. The attacker created a mount point on the dir directory to point to \rpc control and a symbolic link in the object manager with the source value of file txt that will point on some DLL in system32. We start with a call to RTL DOS path name to NTPathName API. This just changes the Win32 path to its NTPath notation. The object manager takes the input name, the NT path, and parses its components, which are each separated by a \, until it finds the object that is the target of the request. Basically, every component of the path will be called with a lookup function, with the OBP lookup object in the object manager. The C directory will get the device path we saw earlier. The D directory will be translated to its mount point directory, the object directory \rpc control. And the file name file.txt will be translated to the symlink we created. In this case, the symlink value of C Windows System32 Windows Core Device Info DLL. So the create file operation the service did, thinking it works on cdir file.txt, will be reparsed to C Windows System32 Windows Core Device Info.dll. Now, let's go through a real example. This is a bug in Windows service called still image acquisition events. Now, I really don't know even one bit about this service, and I almost fell asleep by reading the MSDN description. Luckily, when you do bug hunting and doing it automatically, you do not need to familiarize yourself with the target in most cases. The vulnerability here is pretty simple. We have a service that is implemented in a DLL, WIA RPC. As you can probably guess, it is an RPC service that allows the user to interact. By interacting with WIA RPC, in turn, the service creates a log file in windir debug WIA, which is writable by a regular user. So far so good, and it continues to write to the file followed by a call to set security file, allowing a regular user the option to edit its content. We can easily abuse it by placing a mount point and a symbolic link over it. The mount point will point to \rpc control, and the symlink will point to a new DLL that will be loaded by the system service. We can easily abuse it, placing a mount point and a symlink over it. The mount point will point to \rpc control, and the symlink will point to the new DLL that can be loaded by some of the system services. We can edit the target file because of the call to set security file, which changes its permissions. Without it, we could just create an arbitrary file in arbitrary location, but without having the ability to edit it. So, how did Microsoft fix it? And how can we prevent similar bugs? For starters, you can just make sure the directory that holds the log file will be admin ACL'd, preventing a regular user from having write permissions and breaking the first part of the exploit, which is creating a mount point. Besides that, privileged software should do token impersonation on the user whenever it's possible. If the service would have impersonated the user, then we couldn't abuse this. This is somewhat easier said than done because there are many code paths, and in some of the cases we would actually need our system level token, and in other cases we should use an impersonation token. This, alongside incorrect file permissions, are the root causes of so many bugs. Let's go to our second, simpler attacking method. I know this is a silly image, but truth be told that almost any product that I checked, created by a PC vendor, suffered from DLL hijacking. I assume you are familiar with DLL hijacking, so I'll speed run my explanation about this attack. DLL hijacking is a simple and effective way to inject code into a process that almost every security product failed to catch because of the fear of false positive. The way it works is that executables want to load additional code on the runtime. The thread calls load library in order to load a DLL. We get the H module back and the DLL file will be mapped into the caller's address space. A function named DLL main will soon be called, which is unsurprisingly inside the DLL binary. This function is supposed to be used for initialization of variables, but in our case we just put malicious code inside the DLL main. Unfortunately, there is one annoying thing about DLL hijacking, which is implementing all its export points. You see, the loader won't be happy if you do not have all the exported function as the original DLL has, and it will terminate your privilege process upon loading the malicious DLL, which is a thing we certainly don't want. Here we can see that we have to implement a large number of functions. Surprisingly, there is an elegant way to overcome it, by the wonderful feature called DLL Proxy. We can specify to the linker to forward the request on a given export point to a different DLL. The compiled binary will have a reference to the actual function it intends to call. This makes the attack a lot simpler. Just forward an export point to the real DLL and proceed as normal. It is also easy to generate a bunch of semi-malicious DLL for all the DLLs that are being used on Windows, so every time a component tries to load a DLL, we can forward it to the real DLL. Now, where is this attack most useful? Well, the answer is installers. Installers are arguably one of the worst software components ever written, and they're the prime target of DLL hijacking attacks, and the reasons are they are almost always privileged. They need to write many new files into systems directory, edit the registry, and sometimes install drivers. Therefore, they need to have privileges to do so. Installers often use unpatched installation frameworks like InstallShield and InnoSetup. Just a few names that pop into mind. Software developers do not emphasize on upgrading the installer. They emphasize on upgrading what it installs. The product they install could be very secure, but its wrapper software is like a Swiss cheese piece. In other words, installers can be compared to a diamond ring inside a plastic bag. Yes, it is that bad. Also, they do not have any security checks, like they do not check the DLLs that they are about to be loaded to be digitally signed, even though it's an option since Windows Vista. Weirdly enough, even Microsoft that recommends it does not do it. I have checked around 120 installers in my research, and only 4 of them checked if the would-be loaded DLLs are digitally signed. They are also prime target of symlink attacks, because they create a lot of log files inside subdirectories of the program data folder, and this directory on default is not admin protected. So this is another thing that installers are not safe. An example of it will be a vulnerability inside Dell's dupe installation framework. The bug is a straightforward one. Dell created an installation framework called dupe, which unifies a bunch of software into one place. The dupe installer is a framework that rides on the InstallSheet framework. It is known that upon a load library call, Windows starts looking for the DLL in the local folder first, then in other places like the system folders. So the developers decided to copy the dupe installer into program data, DLL drivers, and some GUID, followed by trying to load a bunch of DLLs. These DLL files do not exist in the newly created directory, so we can put our malicious DLL there, and it will be happily loaded by the installer since the default permissions of the directory of program data are permissive. There are probably two things you ask yourself. Why does the installer try to load many DLLs that do not exist there in the first place, and what is that GUID? Can we guess it? First, those DLLs are being sought after an outdated installation framework without no good reason. The installer doesn't care if it actually loads them or not. Also, these DLLs actually exist in the System32 directory, but they are being searched first in the current directory, because that's how Windows search and load DLL algorithm works. Getting the GUID before the attack is also easy, because you do not really need to know it. You can just wait for the new created directory to be created. Inside C program data DLL drivers, all you need is to create a file system watcher or use a projected file system that watches on this path. It will fire desired behavior upon the directory creation event. Then you can copy your malicious DLL into the newly created installation framework, and the installer will load it with no question asked. It is important to add that you need admin privileges to install the product. Many installers are being executed by an updating programs on demand or automatically on your machine. Those update programs are of course run in a privileged context. This is why I called it earlier lazy privilege escalation. You wait for installers to make those mistakes, and you just wait with a file system watchers and some DLLs, and you can get privilege escalation from it. Mitigating it is easy. Instead of using the old load library API, you can use load library EX API. This API is a lot more secure, allowing developers to add flags that prevent DLLs loading from the directories that are not the system directories. You can also specify the full DLL's path, and of course you can also check the DLL to be digitally signed. So many options we have, let's see some people using them. After viewing those two exploitation methods, we can ask ourselves how we can automate the entire loop of finding privileged file operations and exploiting them automatically. So I developed a system called Ichnaea. Ichnaea tries to implement the whole chain of attack: monitoring, tracing, and exploiting. Ichnaea does it automatically, and it comes on two flavors. The first one is constant monitoring. In this mode, we check every privileged file operations on the operating system, except some operations from specific processes that we can safely ignore. Through their lifetime, services do actions upon specific triggers. Let it be an event or some other behavior. Therefore, sampling each file operation allows us to know if a given service can be abused. In this way, the vulnerability in the service shown earlier has been found. The second mode is checking if a given application is vulnerable to such attacks. The dataset is primarily speaking installers and update programs. As we stated before, installers are mostly executed by administrators. They are also active for a short period of time, doing their privileged file operations on the initial execution. This is how the vulnerability in DLL's installation framework was discovered. You can see that their behavioral profile is a bit different than services. Luckily, it is easier to discover vulnerabilities in such situations, because we are not limited to a specific execution sequence that often occurs in services. The fun part is that we can make an impressive dataset of installers and feed them to Ichnaea. Another interesting thing is that occasionally the installers will create services and that we can later feed them back to the system. Now let's take a look at the technical details. To monitor the file system operations of a program, we must have a mini filter file system driver. It allows us to hook relevant ERPs that can be used to determine if a given application is vulnerable. Those that come from the background like Linux or macOS do not have ERPs because of a different driver architecture. In Windows, drivers are stacked on each other, in contrast to Linux. Each driver is a module that can be loaded and unloaded dynamically. Now, ERPs are I/O packet data structures that are being used in communication between drivers with the operating system. Those ERPs are packets represented by a single pointer to a data structure instead of many pointers to arguments. ERPs are often queued for easier usage of drivers. The reasons we care about them is that in each file access operation done by a thread triggers an ERP in the kernel. In other words, every create file operation causes our mini filter driver to receive an ERP. I want to point out that almost every code piece in the driver is being taken from Microsoft GitHub, where you can see an example for a mini filter that does filter, create, write, and delete operations. The ERPs that we care about are mjcreate, mjwrite, and mjsetInformation. Well, the first one, mjcreate, is not surprising. It's triggered by a create file operation. So every time a thread calls create file, this ERP will pop. Identifying it allows arbitrary create primitives with a symlink attack and finding potential DLL hijacking opportunities. The ERP mjwrite is being generated upon a write file operation. This is useful to understand if we want to exploit the arbitrary write type of vulnerabilities. Lastly, the ERP mjsetInformation is useful in case we want to achieve arbitrary delete. We need to check the setInformation class to know if its type is setDispositionInformation or setDispositionInformationFile.ex, which indicates the file to be deleted. So after catching the ERPs, we need a way to identify the thread that generated the ERP runs in a privileged process. We do it by calling ZWOpenThread_token.ex. We can grab the token and we can check if the privileged user owns it. We do it instead of calling ZWOpenProcess_token.ex because we want the thread specific token and not necessarily the primary token of a process. In the case the thread uses its impersonation token, this will help us to prevent false positives. So what we do in the driver is logging the name, the path, and the command line of the current process, followed by parsing the destination path, which is the path the privileged code is trying to access. This is done by extracting it from the ERP packet. We continue by calling SE_accessCheck on the file with the token of the local guest user. By doing so, we can know if a limited user has access to the file at the end of the path. If we have access to the path, we continue to the exploitation phase. To help the driver, I created a local service that implements either DLL hijacking or a symlink attack. The minifilter driver sends to the service the ERP type we got. This is important because the way we try to exploit arbitrary create files is different than arbitrary delete. The target path should be different also. Then we impersonate the limited local user and create a mount point and a symlink within the impersonated thread to the destination path. This guarantees us to mimic an elevation of privilege attack, since using the token of a logger service is not that useful. The service checks if the file been accessed. In case of a write operation, check if it's been edited. In delete, well, check if the destination file is gone. After that, log the results to know if the attack has been successful. The monitor and exploitation process of DLL hijacking is fairly similar. Here the driver also catches the ERP of mjcreate, then it checks if the target path ends with .dll. I know it sounds kind of lame, I thought about it too, but it works. Most of the create file operations done on files that end up with .dll will follow up by loading it. We can also use the pssetLoadImage notifying routine to verify it. Lastly, we do the same as before, checking if we can access the target path. The service continues by impersonating the local user like in the symlink exploitation, followed by planting a semi-malicious DLL that does DLL proxy if it's a known DLL. Otherwise, we just create a DLL with the desired name, hoping it will be loaded. Now, let's see a quick example of a very recent bug discovered and fully exploited by Ichnaea. Here we look at two vulnerabilities in Intel Support Assistant, which both have the same root source. Intel Support Assistant is an updater service that tries to download and install the latest drivers on your machine. The code responsible for writing the new updates and the deletion of older versions do not impersonate the local user, and therefore we have two vulnerabilities because of it. For some reasons, the service tries to delete previous versions of the updates inside Intel Support Assistant inside the downloads folder. It might be a rollback mechanism of some sort. Also, it tries to write the updated versions into the same very directory. As an unprivileged user, we can ask the service to scan our machine for new versions and download them. This will cause the service to do a cleanup of its directory inside the downloads directory. So we can place a mount point and a symlink on a file and it will be reparsed to any file, granting us arbitrary delete. Alternatively, we can choose to download the updates. If we put a mount point and a symlink, the service will follow them, writing the payload to whatever we want. We also have luck on our side because it later calls a security file if things were not bad enough, so we actually gain arbitrary write because of it. So Ichnaea got IRP MJ set information. It extracted the information class to determine if it's of the type of set disposition information file or a set disposition information file EX, which this is actually the case. Then it checked the security context of the thread that did the delete operation. The service was notified, so we created a mount point and a symlink and the target file got deleted. In the same way Ichnaea implemented arbitrary write attack, we were later fortunate because of the call of set security file as we saw before. Having an automatic system that finds vulnerabilities in services and installers is not that hard thing to do. Everyone who has some experience on writing mini-filter drivers could probably create a better one than I did. I'm not a programmer. By using the system I was able to find a vast number of bugs. The system just looked if two exploitation methods could be used, imagining adding the automation of other methods to find even more vulnerabilities. A similar system can be useful for both developers and security researchers alike. Mitigating against those two exploitation methods is not that hard. It's pretty simple. Loading only signed DLL has been an option since Windows Vista. Still, no one seems to implement DLL signature checking. This altogether will remove the risk of DLL hijacking for good. Regarding the symlink vulnerabilities, just change the access control list of the directory. Besides the joy of finding security bugs, I now understand the danger of doing privileged file operations irresponsibly. In other words, I like less the amount of stuff vendors put on my machine right off the box. As you can see, the road to privilege escalation is not that long. Before we finish, here is a picture that shows some numbers. 28 vendors were tested and were found to be vulnerable, over 90 bugs were being discovered, and over 120 cases were opened. Trust me, those are a lot of emails, and if you want any tip from me, don't do it from your private account. Do not repeat the mistake I did. And if you remember one thing from this talk, do privilege escalations with care. I did not start this research from scratch. I want to thank James Forshaw for his blogs and awesome tools, specifically speaking his anti-object manager package. Also thanks for Clement for his great blogs, and lastly to Microsoft for their all examples about mini-filter drivers. It will be very difficult to do it without them. And that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can also contact me on my email and on my Twitter account.
Thank you, Eran, for having shared with us such a powerful methodology to identify high security vulnerabilities in Windows systems. And our audience has some question for you. Let's go. So the first one is about the installers. So do you have an idea of the percentage of installers you found to be vulnerable? And are you aware if there are any malware in the wild that is able to exploit this fact to programmatically perform the privilege escalation?
Thanks, Lena. Well, in the beginning of the research, I think the number of vulnerable installers were around 95% of them, made by big vendors like Microsoft, Intel, Dell, and whatever. I didn't check smaller ones. After sending reports to them, I think the number reduced dramatically to around 10%. So I feel a lot more secure in that regard. And many malware try to do privilege escalation, especially trying to execute some one-day strategy, less of 0 days. But since I think last several years, I haven't seen one that actually exploited DLL hijacking. But I'm not that up to date in the last few years of that. but it's pretty easy to actually execute it, and antivirus products do not do anything because it's a feature of the operating system. I hope it answers the question.
Okay, thank you. The second one is regarding Ichnaea. One guy asked us if it's an open source tool available somewhere. Probably the community wants to contribute in such an interesting tool.
So great, and thanks for the question. Well, let's not be confused with the Mozilla's framework Ichnaea, which I accidentally named the same. I didn't know about it when I developed it. I really hope to publish it and open it soon at GitHub. I do have some problems of it from the place which I work in that concerning it, but as you have seen, it's pretty easy to do the same as I did, and you can contact me on whenever a question you have regarding mini filter drivers to actually do the same and probably better.
Okay, I really don't know. It's so easy to do it. You made a really good job, and so maybe it's good starting point even for community to contribute and enlarge and enhance this kind of tool. That could be really, really useful. And the last one, I think, is will you plan to further develop or extend the tool you developed, for example, for exploring other corner cases?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Even though my research subject a bit shifted through driver exploitation, there are some connections to be done with this, and the backbone, which is actually the mini filter driver, is also very useful in driver exploitation. So yes, I do believe that I will find more bugs in that area, but I haven't tested any other file exploitation methods that I wish to automate. But if you have some examples, I'll be more than happy to go for it.
Okay, really interesting. So maybe in NoHat 2021, we will have you to explain us how to exploit drivers. That is another really interesting topic.
Yeah, I only found 2 bugs so far, but not 60 days. But let's hope it will continue.
You have 1 year in order to find other bugs. So thank you very much again, Eran, for your presentation, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.